You're listening to the We Are Libertarians Podcast Network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com. Leslie Corbly is an independent writer from a Christian libertarian perspective. She navigates the intersection of faith, culture, and politics, providing a unique critique through the art of poetry. In this episode, we dive into her recently released poetry collection, Silent Suffering, Poems of Pain and Purpose, which critically reflects on postmodern culture, which is dominated by progressivism. She shares her experiences, her motivations, and the profound messages behind her work. But before we get into our conversation, I asked Leslie to share one of her poems, so please enjoy one titled, What is Good?
What is good? People are good, or is this true? Do they act as they should? This question plagues the open mind. What is loving, good, and kind? Who ultimately decides? What makes traits good? This question leaves all confused, for it is not often considered how to determine what is true. Confusion compounds as the mind expands. What standard determines good? The honest find it hard to understand. Social expectations often rule our minds, for we do not like to be called unkind. The sands of time dictate perceptions of whether our actions appease the gods of worldly deception, who inject our minds with popular disease. Our desire for approval breeds self-deception, calling us to act before we have thought. New ideas or concepts we readily reject, afraid of being cast out, left emotionally distraught. Hateful, bigot, intolerant, unkind, these slurs serve a useful purpose. They control the collective mind, keeping humanity within social service, unable to think freely and unencumbered. In this prison, thought can only scratch the surface. How can we exit this cage? Is there no way out? Think for yourself, make room for doubt. Perhaps you are wrong about goodness, maybe you are unable to see. Goodness and truth cannot be known without riding waves of deep uncertainty.
Here at the Chris Spangle Show, we are dedicated to helping you understand current events in a new and hopeful way. And it takes a lot of resources for our team to make that happen. So please consider supporting our work now via Patreon at supportcss.com so that we can continue to be a sane voice in a media landscape that no longer incentivizes it. Thanks especially to our $100 a month members, Vincent Peichel, Matthew Durbin, and Reinhold. Thanks to all of our patrons for making this show a reality.
You know what's smart? Enjoying a fresh gourmet meal at home that you didn't have to cook. Meet Factor, your loophole in the laws of mealtime. Chef-crafted meals delivered with a tap, ready in just 2 minutes. You know what's even smarter? Treating yourself without cheating your goals. Factor is dietitian approved, chef prepared, and you plated. Pretty smart, huh? Refresh your routine and eat smart with Factor. Learn more at factormeals.com.
Leslie Corbly, thanks so much for being my guest.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so you sent me a pitch. The last time you were on, your Young Voices contributor. I don't know where you're at, if you're still with Libertas and Young Voices and doing some of the policy work, but I think we were talking about privacy, and you sent me an email saying, hey, I'm doing Christian libertarian poetry. And this is the show that would have you on. This is like the perfect intersection. You send that pitch to most people, they go, I don't know. But here at the Chris Spangle Show, we're like, Christian, libertarian, arts, let's do it. So we're so thrilled to have you on.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm independently writing at this point in my career. That's where I've been headed in the past couple of years, which is really exciting. I'm really wanting to highlight voices on what I would consider the margins of progressive thought. So that includes Christians, but not necessarily exclusively, but more designed to highlight some of the hypocrisies and the cultural problems associated with a culture that takes as its preconditions, broadly speaking, postmodern beliefs, right? So think various ideologies that are more far left and the kind of dogmas that would that they would all agree on, and that's more or less what some of my writing is critiquing.
So let's start with, where are you writing at? Are you on a Substack, or what's your website? Where can people follow your writing and the poetry that we're going to talk about?
Absolutely. Yes, I do have Substack. I have Substack and Patreon, although I would say Substack's more active. I'll probably actually be uploading a new poem to Substack sometime in the next day or two. So I produce monthly content for Substack, and that's where you'll find, I just released a poetry collection titled Silent Suffering, Poems of Pain and Purpose. And so it's a collection of, think of like very more philosophically driven poems that critique sort of the current era we're in, right? So again, think postmodern era, which I think historians have dated back to roughly right after World War II is when that movement of thought became much more popular culturally. So again, it's designed to look at what would the cultural gatekeepers of power in our current era hold to, and then what's at the margin of that thought. So you can find that on Amazon. And then the poetry, kind of a fun thing though, is that the poetry for Substack is actually poems not in the collection. So new poetry, and then it will include an inspiration behind the poem, like why I wrote it.
So if we go, forgive me, so if you go to Amazon, you can buy a book, and you look up, okay, all right, you sent me the link here, and I failed to click the link. Being a Bad Host, Silent Suffering, Poems of Pain and Purpose by Leslie Corbly, which you can find at Amazon, and I'll make sure that we put that in the link. But we'll define some terms and get into the cultural conversation after this question, and I hope you forgive me for being rude to a guest, but poetry? Really? Like, why poetry? Like, why not start a TikTok and rant and like, why, or maybe some music, or what's poetry? Why'd you choose that?
You know what? It's a fair question. I would expect to get that. So actually, I started with poetry intentionally. So one of the reasons I started with that is because I believe the most fundamental aspects of the human experience and human reality are pain and love. And and so I started with pain, right? That's one of the things we pretty much all are hardwired to be able to connect to. And it's also something that on the progressive side is often talked about in the sense of against traditional leanings and highlighting of how certain traditional values and the way they're lived out culturally can cause pain and harm. And as a Christian, I'm actually glad for that, because I don't think homogeneous thought leads us closer to God or makes us better people or better Christians. And there's, of course, ways in which, even if you follow what is right and you have great beliefs, there's ways in which people live that out that cause pain, that they don't understand maybe how someone else's experiences would converge with their beliefs and cause harm. And so I intentionally started with poetry as a way to expose the philosophical hypocrisies that progressives and more postmodern ideologues might hold, as a way to show that pain is not political, in the sense that whatever belief system you hold is going to have people at its margins. And that's where those people will experience a degree of cultural pain that maybe those in the broader, like more majority society wouldn't understand. So as our society becomes more homogeneous, there's more types of cultural pain.
So let's break this down just so I make sure that we're talking the same language. The term that I often use is secular. Because if you are a Christian and you're reading Christian media and books and going to church, and it makes up a lot of your social circles, a lot of times your social circles and content you read online, videos that you watch, whatever, is distinctly different from secular media, right? Secular content. And that is, I would say, the secular content is largely now center-left leaning. I think when I was growing up in the 90s, it was a little more center-right. We were more of a cultural Christian nation than we are now. So when you say progressive and you say majority culture, are we saying the same thing by saying secular and progressive majority?
I think so, yeah. I think I'm especially coming from the perspective both of what I would consider to be the majority so probably what I would consider to be the majority of cultural gatekeepers, right? So if you were to go somewhere in an academic setting or somewhere in media or try to scale up socioeconomically in various professions, you'd be looking at a largely what I would consider to be, yes, secular, but more broadly than that, progressive, because I think seculars who dissent from more of that progressive mindset increasingly find themselves on the margins.
Yeah, and this is one thing that I find interesting about the Christian conversation, especially on the right. I'm a creature of the right. I'm guessing you probably are there too. Is this notion of Christian martyrdom in America, right? Where you're really, as a Christian, called to be set apart, to be different, and to basically take a piece of heaven and serve the people around you and bring and redeem culture and relationships and work and every single piece so people get a view of heaven through your life. Like, that's the point. And you're naturally going to be out of step with the majority in whatever culture you're in. Like, it's just one of the deals that comes with being a Christian and being a faithful Christian, I should say, not a cultural Christian. So I look at kind of the feelings of persecution and I go, that's the right feeling. We should feel a little bit of that pain. We really should feel some of that discomfort, because that's what we're called to be, is something different, something set apart, something unique. So it captures people's attention and then they see something different, which is, the teachings of Jesus being taught out. How you sound like you're describing that through pain, suffering. You're not talking martyrdom. I don't think you're speaking the same language as maybe like a Turning Points USA conference, right? How much do you, what do you think about what I'm saying? And how much does that connect to the work and what you're thinking right now?
It does connect to it. So if anyone who's familiar with Christian existentialism, if they read this collection, will see glimpses of that inspiration throughout the collection. It's pretty baked into both the structure of the overall collection and the structure of the poems themselves. So interestingly enough, the poems start with a section called Yearnings, which is designed to explore the yearnings we all face in a fallen world. Yearnings to understand our desires, yearnings of apathy that we don't really know how to deal with the pain of life, and also the yearnings of death that come that sort of almost haunt you when you sense that life will involve an inherent form of suffering from which you can't really escape. And so that connects to my hope is it can connect to the idea of a living sacrifice, right? Actually, Christians are called, their lives themselves are living sacrifices. And by that, I think it is intended to be not embracing suffering like I want to suffer, but an embrace of suffering as a necessary aspect of life, and the understanding that you don't live for yourself. You're not living for your own sense of earthly happiness. You're living for something higher than that transcends the pain you're going to experience in this world. And that may be pain that you can't control. And it may be an unabating sense of despair. And I think that's really important for Christians. And frankly, my hope is that this can connect not only with Christians, but with others who feel the weight of the despair of our moment, right? There's a lot of loneliness and despair in the world right now. And my hope is that can connect with others as well, that the fact that you can't control how much pain you feel on earth isn't really the point of continued existence, right? It's not nihilism. It's not all despair, right? So it starts with yearnings and then it moves into sort of, we all grapple with infinitely complex topics, such as how to define morality and goodness and God. These aren't things you can attempt to understand without, I don't think, an innate awareness of your own lack of ability to absolutely understand what it is you're looking at or what it is that you're attempting to define, right? Goodness isn't something that you or I can just define simply and expect others to come to the same conclusion.
Yeah. I think in your pitch, you say modern culture struggles to answer the deepest questions about life. And I think if you were to try to define modern culture for most people, right, it would be basically on their glowing rectangle and what they see on their feed, right? Like when we think culture, we think the TikToks that we see or the clips that we see, or right now I'm big into basketball. And so my culture right now is a lot of basketball clips and I don't know. But then when those deeper questions come up, that kind of amusing yourself to death, I think we really struggled as a country through COVID. Because now all of a sudden we have lost the ability to lament or to process grief publicly or to deal with things that are weightier. Or right now, inflation is very difficult. Like Hody, one of the hosts here on the network, works at a food pantry, and he's like, you're seeing cars that cost $100,000 come through the line because their credit cards have run out, and now we're giving them food from the food bank. And that's very difficult. That's very stressful, right? The economy is causing a lot of pain, and we don't really have mechanisms to deal with those things because culture can't answer those things the way that the Bible can, the way that Christianity can. Because culture, in my mind, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, it's you are supposed to be happy, and if you are not happy, if you are not feeling entertained, if you're feeling bored, something's wrong. If you're feeling stress, something's wrong. If you're feeling like you don't have time for self-care, something is wrong. And so we operate from this anxiety of something's wrong. I'm looking at everybody else, and everybody else looks like they're doing great on this glowing rectangle, and I'm not. And so I'm struggling with that a lot right now too, career-wise, financially, where our position in our life, instead of stepping back and going, man, I've got an awesome family. Our bills are paid. Like, I've got people to serve. People are serving me. Like, I don't know. It's easy, I think, to get caught up in that flow of the messages of culture in our day and age, which are so contrary to what Scripture teaches.
I absolutely agree with that. I also think that it's easy to get caught up in, I think there's a lot of externalizing going on. So when you talk about something like what I mentioned of infinite complexity, and you're dealing with what is good, what is morality, what is justice, what are these concepts and ideas that everyone seems to really care about? Like, even on the internet, they talk a lot about them. You see the chaos even on college campuses right now. And sort of just the cultural chaos we're in right now seems to me to look like a lot of externalizing of pain. If you can't grapple with the pain and grief in your own life, it can become easier to use some of these ideologies as a way to solve that problem. I'm going to externalize and care more about the problems of the world rather than the problems within my own backyard, because I don't really know how to grapple with these issues. So instead, I'm going to fight with someone on X or Instagram about.
Well, people find identity in politics now. People really.
Exactly.
I was talking the other day about how much, if you made fun of libertarians, how much it affected me, because that's all I had. Like, my political identity in this podcast, that was my whole identity. Now you can say whatever to me. I don't care what some stranger on the internet says. I care what my wife and my kids think. Like, I care what my employers think, my client.
Exactly.
It's a lot different than the weight of a stranger's opinion about my philosophy, which really matters to a lot of people.
But that's where I want people's heads to go, is that your philosophy, this idea that I think was more common, frankly, prior to the postmodern era, certainly, which the postmodern era is much more critical of absolute truth. But prior to that, this idea that you could have a rationality that sort of transcended your emotion and the other aspects of your humanity isn't really true. People are very tied to their philosophies because they identify with them. So when you poke at someone's philosophical viewpoints, often behind that is a lot of human emotion, and a human emotion that drives people a certain way. And people can obviously, I'm not saying that you shouldn't care about your intellect or you should just abandon any desire to be rational in your argumentation or your thoughts. But at the end of the day, this idea that you can segregate the left and right brain isn't true. And that was one of the reasons I chose a poetic format in addition to writing nonfiction. So the nonfiction manuscript isn't yet available. I'm hoping to have that done by the summer and available. My hope is to have it published sometime early next year. But one of the reasons I started with poetry is because it is more emotive. And I think that there's a huge lack on the, especially liberty Christian side, of any engagement with culture from an artistic or
lots of engineers.
Yeah, lots of that type of thought. And I obviously that's what I'm drawn to. I went to law school. Like, I love that way of thinking. That's pretty natural for me. But I do think that there's a need for a structured, emotive way of thinking as well to help bridge that gap between the more Christian libertarian space and culture itself. You can't really reach people who are drowning in grief and pain purely through a rational argument, because they're dealing with things on day-to-day basis that are like weighing on their souls in a way that makes it difficult to connect purely through intellect.
Silent suffering, it's targeting pain. What's the source of that pain? Who's your target audience? Is it people that have lost someone? Is it people who are like, what was the audience that you had in mind when you wrote this collection?
I would say it's broadly people who feel very disenchanted with the postmodern sort of ideologies they see around them. So when they think of the current... And
can you define that for people? Define
Sure,
postmodern,
So
yeah.
Postmodern ideologies would be the assumptions of culture that are now normative from roughly the 1940s or 50s through now. And by culture, again, became increasingly... I would say increasingly common in spaces such as academia, media, law, like places that kind of guard what people will be able to consume. Now, I know a lot of that's going away with the internet. You have a lot more avenues to the idea, for instance, of mainstream media is, in my view, to some degree dying as we have so many more channels. But think of more that what people would often think of as a mainstream view, something that would be common either in a classroom, like an idea that would be difficult to challenge there, in the sense that challenging it would come with a cost, right?
Right.
So that's why I call it more progressive, because I think people connect with that word more, where you could call it more left-wing, radical. It's frustrating because there's several different words you could use to probably get there, but the idea being people probably who feel a little more as if their viewpoints, whether Christian or not, just their viewpoints would put them on the fringes of more polite, quote unquote, society. I'm not a huge fan of the word elite, because I think it can be muddled and have a lot of populist
Right.
sentiment behind it. But again, like those more professional spaces that would have a more guarded approach to discussions that might entail viewpoints that aren't secular, or that aren't, I would say, that aren't kosher according to a more progressive viewpoint. So for instance, the idea that abortion is a human right, that's one in particular that I nitpick. That's something that I think in most professional and social spaces would be considered pretty extreme.
Yeah. So is there something in your story, or your story in totality, that was the inspiration? Was there a singular moment where you went, I just feel lost and out of step, and I want to speak to that? What's the story behind it?
Sure, that's interesting. Like that's cool that you asked that. Yes and no. I mean, I definitely had an odd upbringing. So I was homeschooled way before that was like the popular norm. So think like in the 90s, back when I was a homeschool kid, if I was out in public during school hours, I could pretty much expect someone to make comments about my appearance at the store during.
All right, we figured out the poetry part. It's all right. Okay, got it. Homeschool,
so
nailed it.
Yeah. So that's definitely.
I run the homeschool graduation for Indiana. I get it.
So that was, but interestingly enough, my homeschooling experience was very disconnected from the arts. They were both very mathematical, both had master's degree in math. And so everything in the home was very geared towards high level logical reasoning, very more away from the emotive, but they did have a high
I love that your rebellion is poetry. You're like, I'll show you, mom and dad.
But they did have a high degree of respect for a more classical form. So I blended classical form into this poetry, but I wouldn't call it's weird. It's weird I even identifying as a poet, because it's not something I really had a lot of involvement with. But I will say, as far as inspiration, I probably draw the most inspiration from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but
yeah, I am, but just in case somebody isn't.
Sure. He was a Nazi dissenter back in the 1930s and 40s. He actually died in a concentration camp for his resistance to Nazi rule, and he led the Confessing Church. So he led a group of Christians who directly opposed Nazi rule. So I always bring this up whenever anyone says that the Nazis made deals with the church and that they ignore the Confessing Church. I'm quick to point it out. But there was a poem he wrote titled "Who Am I?" while he was in prison. So he was a very multidisciplinary individual. He was obviously most well known as a theologian of his time, and did a lot of social critique as well. But he engaged a lot with the secular philosophers of the time, including like Martin Heidegger was someone he in particular engaged with. And he also, I believe, composed music, and he wrote poetry as well. And so there was a poem he wrote titled "Who Am I?" that I found to be both very inspirational when I was in high school and deciding what I believed. And that became sort of the impetus for me also writing this collection. So I drew a lot of inspiration from his work, both because I thought he was very influential, both because he was so devoted to his faith, and so he was very able to engage with the culture around him without making the Bible unnecessarily political, right? Yeah. So he was able to critique the culture, which was very politicized at the time, without becoming a partisan party man. And I think that's really important for us as Christians now, not to it's important for us to fight the temptation to fall into partisan party politics.
There's a book that I think is a catchy title because it caught my eye. It's called Biblical Critical Theory by Christopher Watkin, who's a Reformed adjacent writer. And it's a tremendous book. It basically takes Augustine's City of God and the critique of his own time in that work, comparing Rome to the City of God, and articulates how we in our own time can be cultural critics about these things without being what my friend Rex Bell calls leading with your chin, right? I think so often there's a gentleman running for lieutenant governor who I had lunch with here. He's like, Christians should be the rod. And I think politics and Christianity should be melded, because we should fight for what we believe in. It should be influenced through the political system. Because, yes, the rod and the staff. I think Christians often want to be meek when really we need to be tough and say, because that's how you're going to advance the ball. I would not, he may be a Christian nationalist. I don't know how he describes himself. I'm not going to say that, but I think it is on the mind, and you touched on it, in terms of people's view of the World Magazine, which is a Christian news magazine that's great. Their cover is a debate about Christian nationalism. Doug Wilson, one of the foremost, I'll say, perpetrators, went on Tucker Carlson to promote his ideas of Christendom. It is something that's gaining in intellectual circles and on the right. It's, I think, a perversion of the Christian message, right? I think I agree with you, and I'm not putting all that on you, but right, like we should articulate Christian viewpoints and stand up for what we believe. At the same time, we ought to not let our peanut butter and our chocolate mix when it comes to politics, right? I think you should understand culture, understand news, current events, politics, but understand that you are not a Preston Sprinkle's new book, Exiles, is really good, and it talks about this. You can never forget that the Christian Democrat has more in common with you than like the Christian, like non-Christian Republican, if you're a Christian nationalist. That essentially, I saw something on Twitter, Megan Basham, who's this Christian writer, goes on Tucker Carlson and really slams David French and Russell Moore. And I'm sitting there going, that's the exact wrong thing that we should do. If you're a Christian, you're not supposed to go on and slam and get really tough. To me, that's giving into the incentives of virality in media. I'm going to really do what gets attention as opposed to doing what Scripture teaches us to do, which is to have some Christian unity and really try to work together. So I think that to me is one pain point that I have. Yeah, I definitely feel that tension as a Christian with progressive culture, but I also feel it with the right. So I don't know how much of your work touches on that part too, of I see my own people going in a direction that I don't particularly like.
I would say that's coming down the pipe. So I have a vision for where I want my writing to go. And I would say the foundation starts with the critique of the left side. I'm going to be completely honest about that. So if you were to pick up the work, you would see less critique of the right. That's not because, though, that I don't think that there's a lot of issues in that regard. It's mostly a strategic decision from a writing standpoint of how much information can you put into one work versus another, what's more appropriate down the line. So it's a lot more editorial decisions than it is a philosophic statement that I think somehow progressive culture is unique in its badness. I don't think that at all. It's more designed to situate my readers and listeners in the moment so that the critiques of the right side of the aisle, I think down the road will make more sense. So I will say, I will frame it that way. And then another reason for that is that I think that culture increasingly is becoming, and by culture, again, majority cultures that gatekeep, like think of the ideas if you were in a professional environment that could probably get you canceled. They're probably going to be ideas that are more center left right now. That doesn't mean that will hold true in the future. Yeah. We all know one of the problems with cancel culture is that we don't know what will hold true in the future, which is part of why
cancel culture is over. Like Google fired 20 employees today because they are too far left.
Really? Oh, was this from the? Yeah, I was gonna say things are so in flux, particularly with the Palestine-Israel debate. I think that some of these things you're already seeing a lot of sea changes as it relates to how these things are operating. But I would say one of the really big reasons I started, frankly, with discussions on the left is because I think that there are very important issues related to the implications of and I think it's pretty broadly left wing now, but not exclusively, but I can't think of very many center left organizations that don't take a pretty hard stance as it relates to abortion being a human right. And I think and I don't even just mean we as Christians, we as a society really have a lot of work to do as it relates to talking about human dignity in a coherent and consistent fashion. And by that, if you believe life has certain inherent value, that's going to come with certain implications. And if you don't, that will come with a different set of implications. And I think right now, our society and culture has a very confusing, and there's a lot of cognitive dissonance in the mind of people who hold to the idea that life is sacred outside the womb and not inside the womb.
Right.
And by that, I think, and my poetry does specifically touch on this for this reason, that it is very difficult, for example, to, in my view, to argue that there's a certain group of human beings who, and that would be women, frankly, who, because of the unique nature of pregnancy, which obviously impacts women from a bodily standpoint in ways it doesn't impact anyone else, that's pretty undeniable. But if you're going to say because of that, then this class of people has the just authority to determine the worth of another human life, what you're saying is that women in some real sense have the just authority to determine which human beings get to partake and play in the game of life.
Yeah.
That's more or less what you're saying. Now, let's say that's true. You believe that's true. It becomes, in my view, very difficult then to argue that the humans that come into the game of life don't have the just authority to make the same moral calculation. Why can they then not determine whether they want to live or die? And I think when you see in the Western world with a lot of increase in the impetus towards euthanasia, assisted suicide, things of that nature, both in Canada and the Netherlands, it's becoming more common. What you're seeing is, frankly, in my view, a continuation of a philosophic statement, it's a consistent expression of a philosophic belief about the innate worth of people. Now, as it relates to the poetry, I didn't put anything about maid in the poetry, but as it relates to the poetry, there's another fundamental tension on the left side of the aisle that and the reason I bring this up is I don't see this discussed anywhere. So I thought this is really important to discuss, is that you have discussions of the hypocrisy of Christians as it relates to how they treat certain historically marginalized groups. For example, trans people. That's the most relevant example here. The idea being that the ways in which religious or center-right people, whether religious or not, frankly, is fairly irrelevant, but the ways in which they treat trans people may suggest that they think trans people shouldn't exist. Now, I'm going to be the first to admit that there's some rhetoric going on around people that I think is really
if you're like the head of the Babylon Bee and you claim that trans people are mentally ill, and then you continually make fun of a mentally ill person, that doesn't make you a good person. That makes you someone who is mean to people that are mentally ill, right? That to me is just an inconsistent ethic on our own side, but I agree with you. I just think I decided a couple years ago, 2-3 years ago, that the main thing for me in terms of a paradigm in which to examine current events was to get really clear about the Imago Dei. That we are created in the image of God. And so what are all the different things that spring up out of that? It isn't just the abortion issue. That then extends to all kinds of different ethics that progressives will reject and sometimes conservatives. Where does your sense of justice come from? Why is it illegal to murder someone? Why is it illegal to rape someone? It is because they are created in the image of God that we are a distinct and separate and special class of being as opposed to just another animal meat sack walking around, right? And when I think, to me, that extends to immigration, right? Which is why I'm more, quote unquote, liberal on immigration than maybe other people. I just think if we think these are natural rights, then they extend to people that aren't citizens, right? Like that. I think that getting clear on that piece for me was very instructive, and I hear you doing that same work through what you're doing with the poetry.
I think that see a lot of the tensions on both the left and right as two sides of the same coin. So, for example, you're not wrong that I don't think if you truly are on the right and you're saying there's just transgender dysphoria as a manifestation of some kind of mental illness, well, then the way you talk to those people
it determines your character.
It's going to tell people what you think of how you should treat mentally ill individuals. And I think that's a very important thing to note. And similarly, if you're the kind of person who's saying, hey, you on the right are treating these people really poorly, you're maybe suggesting that they shouldn't exist in some real sense, at least according to their own beliefs, they shouldn't exist. And I think that's a fair critique. If someone believes something fundamental about gender that you don't, an appropriate response is to engage with some degree of compassion and to state which beliefs you don't hold, right? I don't think you can become, so if your stance is, I don't believe a man can become a woman, fair enough, but there's no need to become derogatory in any way by stating that again, that's a fair critique of the right, but I think it's an equally fair critique that I've never heard of the left of, if you truly believe that all human beings post-birth have some of this innate value, you're going to face a real tension between that belief and the reality that there are now thousands, well over 30,000 that researchers have identified of individuals who are born purely because the Supreme Court made the ruling they did in Dobbs. So what do you do with those children's lives? Your view of justice and of human rights is, quite frankly, tells those people that they shouldn't be here.
Right.
And in a real way makes them second class in the eyes of society. Now, I'm not saying, obviously, these are infant children, but this was an issue that has frankly been alive since Roe v. Wade, in the sense of, let's take an example of, people often use, for instance, pregnancies with minors as a way to highlight hypocrisies on the pro-life side. But the same holds true for the left-wing side of the aisle. What if there's a 15-year-old who disagrees with her parents and wants to keep the baby? Is she going to be able to go to Planned Parenthood and expect them to give her prenatal care? Probably not. Is she going to be able to go to a pro-abortion, like where in the pro-abortion network is she going to be able to preserve the life that she thinks she wants to preserve, or that she believes she wants to preserve? And there's always been children that have come from these messy situations, many of which are aware of from where they, the circumstances of their conception. And that does place, I think, an unseen cost on those children of, would they be better off alive or dead?
Yeah.
And so I think that when you talk about, there's this idea that you can segregate that, right? That it's just in utero and it's not a life yet and it's viewed as primitive. And there's a lot of...
It's also creating a victim class of both mother and child, because they didn't get to choose whether or not the baby lived or died.
There's that, but even so, I'm going, do you really want the idea that someone was unwanted before birth to be what defines them? Because in some way, that's what you're saying. You weren't wanted. It would have been better had you not been at all, had you never been alive. And so I think that if your stance is that we should treat everyone with care and compassion, and you can't look at that log in your eye, there's a disconnect, right? There's a cognitive dissonance that isn't really often talked about or really discussed in the reality of the terms that it exists.
Yeah. I just think degree, right? When it comes to abortion, okay, we can look at the 12-year-olds and use them as the baseline for our argument, or we can look at the birth control abortions, which are like overwhelmingly the typical abortion. Like Bill Clinton was at least honest and said, I'm not crazy about that, right? Now this is healthcare. It's not having a toe amputated because of diabetes. It's a little bit different.
But that's unfortunately where I'm concerned, right? That we're moving in this direction of having policy conversations about people, right? Because, and partially, that's part of the reason I'm libertarian, frankly, is because I think it's so damaging when you give government so much policy power, because then all of your ability to separate culture and it becomes almost impossible. And of course, there's some degree of overlap always between politics and culture, but increasingly our policy decisions impact people at a level that they shouldn't impact them, in my view. Of course, with abortion, you're in a little bit of a different territory because it's impossible for the policy not to impact people. But I don't think that we're engaging with the actual varying ways in which pain and marginalization emerges in a heterodox society. So if it's okay, I was going to go ahead and define that.
Sure.
So if you're more on the left secular side of the aisle and you think people should be able to actualize their beliefs regardless of how niche they may be, one of the things I think leftists then ignore is that if you have a shared system of belief, it is easier to identify who falls on the margin of society because there aren't as many beliefs competing. But as you insert more complexity, more different beliefs, you actually increase the variance, like the varying degrees and types of pain and types of marginalization, because it becomes related to a smaller niche community that exists in a larger whole. And I think we're increasingly seeing that in society, and I don't see a lot of discussion of it. And I think the more we're able to, again, as much as I think it's fantastic that we critique the right side of the aisle, I think there's more fleshed out critiques of that because it's been ongoing for longer. And I don't see as many corresponding criticisms as it relates to who falls on the margins of new beliefs as they emerge. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think there's partially you're right, because they're going to do it again, right? Trump got something like $2 billion in free advertising in 2016, and that's how he won. And now it's wall to wall. We promised not to do it in 2024. Okay, you're doing it again, right? And so I think he has come along and shown a spotlight for moneyed media, right? I'm not going to say mainstream media, but media that has resources that can drive a lot of these conversations, because he is unique, he is different, and he does represent a subculture of America that people don't understand. Like, coming from rural America, coming from suburban America, I understand, like, and being libertarian, I understand these people perfectly. That's why I'm more critical, right? Because I'm more familiar with it. I don't know somebody who is as progressive, right? Like, I can pick it out and I see Taylor Swift and I go, okay, she's this way, that way, right? It's just not as intimate to me. But I think the discussion is so much more about the faults of the right. And I do think that there is now an infrastructure for criticism of the left. I just think that a lot of that is done really poorly. And I think that it is done often to fundraise for the new media outlet that they're trying to start, and they're picking topics that people really want to push the buttons on, and it's not always done in a very thoughtful way. And I do think that thoughtful people get drowned out. That's where I do think podcasting and shows like Joe Rogan, they're vilified by the left because they give an unfettered access to Theo Vaughn, comedian, doesn't know anything, right? But he has the border chief on for 2 hours. I learned more about what a lot of right-wing conservatives and border people have been talking about in that 2 hours, because it's just unfiltered, right? He got access to a large audience to just say his piece, and it wasn't like filtered through a lens of here's what you need to think about this. And I think that we have an infrastructure now where the left is getting its critique and they hate it.
And that's where I'm hoping to, that's one of the reasons that I entered into this space, really, was because I think that there is a high need for thoughtful critiques of, frankly, both sides. And again, I started with the left because I do think that there are fewer well thought out critiques of the left, and that it's largely drowned out by, those critiques are largely filled by highly politicized narratives that focus less on the reality of the human experience. And that's more what I think needs to be discussed first, frankly, that we need to understand what's actually going on before delving into, and I understand it has to go side by side.
I think it's also harder, and I think you talk about this. So much of the rhetoric of progressives is wrapped up in empathy. Yes. And if you're against them, then you are not empathetic and you don't care about these people. And I think that's a corrosive way to have a public debate of any kind.
It's corrosive, and that's one of the things. It's a subtle theme in my book. It's quite a bit more subtle, but I actually subtly transfer sometimes male pronouns for female pronouns in villainous ways, not to vilify women, of course, but to show how there's actually an assumption, a very strong assumption in culture that predation is primarily a male modus operandi. That, I think, creates a lot of problems as it relates to understanding accurately gender relations.
To translate, men are always the baddies to progressives.
Yes, they're always the ones that are the predators. They're the ones that are going to hurt people. They're the ones that lack empathy. So there's a lack of understanding of what female-driven perpetration of harm looks like. And I think one of those, and again, it's metaphorical. I'm not saying all women do this by any means, right, but one of those things can be a weaponization of the concept of empathy. That if women, for instance, actually in fact possess more emotional intelligence, I think that also is a form of power, right? Because knowledge is power, and the ability to use knowledge in a sophisticated manner is, of course, something that can be used in the wrong way. So I think that it's really important to look at, what do you mean by empathy, right? Again, to whom are you showing empathy? So I would say right now, the progressive left side of the aisle much more controls who in society we're allowed to look at with empathy and compassion versus scorn. And so again, think of Hollywood, who controls most forms of storytelling, and it's going to be primarily on the left. Now there's a few enclaves that are up and coming on the right that may be doing that. But my concern both with the up and coming stuff on the right is that it's going to end up being binary. Does it make sense? So people see this type of pain that the left shows, and then a binary type of pain the right shows, and then there's all this other like unexplored.
It's inherently political. It's not trying to tell a story. Yes. It's like Christian movies at their core are propagandistic. They're not trying to tell a good story. They're trying to tell you a message so you believe the message. And that's why so much of, I think, the critique of the left stuff doesn't really connect with people on the left a lot of times. They're not going to tune into Ben Shapiro and hear something that they think sounds like them, because if you were a progressive, let's say you are a 28-year-old white female who lives in New York City, and you tune into Ben Shapiro, you don't hear someone that understands you, because you think and you have expectations of who you are that are very positive. Just the guy who calls into talk radio has a very positive view of his beliefs, right? Like it is very postmodern in that we have all selected the best view of ourselves, and we reject the fact that I think sometimes your critics are right in terms of what if the trans person that you were talking about, hey, the way you're talking about me makes me feel like you want to kill me. Right?
Yes.
So maybe your messaging is probably not good, right? And I think if you're a right-wing person, you always read the news and get the sense of if Republicans died, the world would be so much better. That's the right. And so there's not this attempt anymore to like persuade. That's why I think like a Jon Stewart connects to people, because he's trying to start at exactly where you're talking about, which is like, let's just take everybody seriously and then figure out toss out the hyperbole.
And I think strengthens
an understanding.
I think that also is important because it strengthens the use of appropriate forms of hyperbole and passion and anger. I think those actually have a place. And I think sometimes they're seen as, for instance, one of the reasons I think David French is often critiqued, or at least what would be a more valid critique if it weren't sometimes just trolls online
right.
saying crazy stuff, but a more valid critique of some on the right, and I don't really want to name him but some on the right would be that there is a tendency to fall into the trap, in particularly in more professional spaces, of, I don't want to appear unempathetic. And sometimes that means ignoring certain types of pain that are primarily caused by progressive cultures that sort of have their own blind spots, right? So I don't think there's anything wrong with exposing that, but I think you lose your persuasive power when you make it nothing but a hatred of those people, or you're constantly using hyperbole, but no one can really take that seriously. And part of the problem, of course, in our broader ecosystem is that's so common. That's pretty much most of what people see now are critiques that are over the top or engage in really unnecessary forms of aggression against someone who disagrees, which is, of course, not really ever valuable. So I think that's where I really tried to combine this discussion of pain with an appropriate use of, hey, there's something real here. So some of the poetry can come off as quite provocative, but it's not cheap provocation, right? It's not a cheapening of the critique of the idea. It's clearly a critique of the idea and its manifestation in society, not a critique of an individual as in you're a terrible human being. You have no purpose existing.
What are some examples of avatars that you were thinking about when you describe some of the pain? What are some pieces of progressive culture that are marginalizing people that you feel, look, I really wanted this poem to speak to this person who's experiencing this?
Definitely, there was definitely a poem very directly related to what I call Dobbs babies, which are children who I feel for them. And some of that is my personal background. I have a background with the verbiage of abortion, which I won't go into here, but if anyone reads the collection, there is a poem that is autobiographical titled The Shadow of Death. And so that in particular for me was one that I felt needed to be highlighted, both because those children, they obviously aren't yet capable of the kind of consciousness that would allow them to understand that some people may have mourned their births, but that is very real, and it will be a real dynamic for them down the line. And they are a tiny minority, but I think it's really important for them to hopefully see that someone someone cared about the plight of what that may feel like for them in a world that otherwise may not. And then as it relates to, gosh, I'm thinking of other avatars. There's a poem on hope in there that I really wanted. I was thinking of kind of the Christian who feels the weight of sort of the despair of our moment, and even people who aren't Christians who feel the weight of the despair of our moment, to really engage with the idea of hope in a real way. And by hope, you're seeking and kind of hope as a habit and a practice of pursuing good in spite of pain increasing. Yeah. Right? Like pain in your life may continue to get worse. You may not see a way out. You may not understand your circumstances, and yet you hope. Right? This idea that sort of to fight almost against this idea of nihilism that is, frankly, philosophically quite rational in our age. In a postmodern age, nihilism, the problem with nihilism is that it's actually very rational. It makes sense for you to give
nihilism
up.
Meaning like nothing matters. It's all going to end in disaster anyways, whatever.
And you can do what you want. I think that and especially for younger generations, I think that we're doing a very poor job of teaching them the purpose of hope. Because if all they have is the ability to express themselves individually with a very individualistic sort of left-wing more ideas of individuality and that you can create your own purpose, when someone feels as if they can't and they fall into deep despair, to them ending their life can very well look like the most rational option according to the idea that maybe they don't want to experience this much pain.
I read about a 28-year-old girl in Britain who decided to end her life through assisted suicide because of depression. And I'm sitting here as someone who's 40, who was that person at 28. And it makes me want to cry about how much she's not going to experience because of all the great things I've experienced. Like obviously I'm like putting myself into her shoes, but I just wanted to say to her, like, you have no idea how much better it gets, because if you, I do think one source of cultural pain, like I'm as an older millennial, I think you're probably a younger millennial. We came up in the late 90s with this like great sense of promise because the internet was going to come in and it was going to offer all these awesome opportunities. And it did. Like everything I do for a career didn't exist when I graduated high school. But it's different, right? We're all going to be famous. We're all going to be changing the world. We're all going to be significant culturally. We're all going to be our own little Winston Churchills, right? And you get to 40 and you go, I graduated high school in a depression or a recession. I graduated college in a recession. It's like gut punch after gut punch economically and socially. And there's just, I've been thinking a lot about this because as older millennials, we just felt like things were going to be a lot more hopeful than they were. And there was always this like notion of we're going to change the world, which is much different than the Gen Z nihilism of it's not going to be changed, just get over it, right? Or Gen X. And that sort of pulling back of, hey, start preparing for retirement now. And I don't know. And it's hard when you were given this frame in school of the world, but in reality, your frame is supposed to be the people at your funeral and their success and your success, as opposed to it really matters who wins, Trump or Biden. It really matters this or that and climate change, blah, blah, blah. Right? There's this global consciousness that was fed into us that I think causes real issues for people in that older millennial generation because it's not going to change. Right? Like that notion of you're going to be happy, you're going to be wealthy, you're going to be where your parents are, you're going to blah, 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 blah. Those things aren't happening because of progressive economic policies, or they're not happening because we were just promised a bunch of bullcrap and worldly notions as opposed to biblical notions. And I think that's one just thing that has just been eating at me the last couple months of, I just see so many of my friends from high school really struggling economically, emotionally. They're not happy, right? Because it's that constant comparison game. And it's all cultural. If they step back and took a real inventory of things, that pain wouldn't be there. But it was implanted in high school.
Some of those themes, it's so interesting that you mentioned all this because some of those are spot on. There's a poem in the collection titled Dissecting Desires, which actually encourages people to do that, to take a step back and look at, because we are fed this idea
that desires are good, right? You should lean into them. You should really understand your desires from a vantage point of satiating them rather than what I think is a more healthy vantage point, which would be understanding what they are, why you're having them, and then voluntarily determining what to do with that. We're not really taught, or I don't think there's a lot of discussion of that aspect of desires. But doing that, I think, has so much benefit because it forces you to take a step back and to really look at the world and yourself from a more macro vantage point that's not quite as zoned in on just what do you want to fulfill yourself, but what is it you should actually, what desires should you be leaning into and which desires should you be fighting? Because this idea that, like, really, truly, even though it's talked about on the left, no one really believes all desires should be satiated. No, you can't really believe that.
Yeah. Like, you really think that, like, pedophiles should be brought into society, welcomed, encouraged? I'm sorry, you need to be followed too.
Well, no one just no one thinks that, because once you have a concept of morality or what's good or just, you can't possibly think every desire can be fulfilled or should be fulfilled. We're all to some degree doing this, whether we're consciously aware of it or not. And then, of course, there's this corresponding concept, which I wrote a poem on, which is reclaiming the concept of prudence. Like, what is it to be prudent in an age of instant gratification and you can hop on your phone and doom scroll for hours or engage in whatever form of escapism is most appealing to you? We live, in my view, in a very impulsive age.
Yeah.
Impulsive action is very much encouraged, both structurally through how we engage socially, like technologically, and I think also philosophically, again, because if there's no general concept of shared values of what's good and bad, it leads to people becoming, in my view, more compulsive, right? Because I think this is good, and if your vantage point of good is only in relation to what you want and desire and think is best for you, you're going to have a hard time not falling into more impulsive and compulsive actions, because I want it, therefore it's good. Therefore it's something I should have. Therefore
we're saying the word "you" a lot because you're thinking about yourself a lot, right? And I think that to me is just fundamentally different than my grandparents, my mom's side, my dad's side.
And so I think there are subtle critiques of the way we use technology. I think I describe it in some places as your eyes are fixed on a screen. We escape in this way. I describe it as well, even with things as simple as what you do and don't see, because that's often baked into code, both literal code, if it's AI, but also the code of our medium. Like you mentioned earlier, we're so siloed, if you're looking at one form of media, you're going to see who's undesirable and you're going to push them out. That's the tendency, right? Because we don't really have any kind of, it doesn't seem to me, strong incentives to actually speak to one another about our pain in a way that is both real, right? Genuine, like, this is what my pain and suffering and feelings of my existential feelings actually look like in real life, with someone who may view that pain in a very different light. Does that make sense? So, for example,
let's put it out on social media and
get follows and attention, but
right.
you're not getting any
dealing
kind
with
of
it.
Yes, and there's no, because I think it's healthy to some degree, again, as long as you're having productive conversations, to talk to someone who may view what happened in your life in a very different light, right? So obviously, the trans debate is an easy one. I hate to keep bringing that up, but it's an easy one because if you believe that you're a man trapped in a woman's body or vice versa, and you're talking to someone who doesn't hold that belief, that's a very uncomfortable conversation. But I don't think it's one that needs to derail into insult hurling or other forms of, like, really negative communication that we often see, because these are
it's an attitude of, it's not my job for you to understand my pain. Most people filter things through their own experiences. So if you want, I hosted a podcast a decade ago, the third trans podcast ever, and it was called Creating Maya, because I wanted to understand why my friend was transitioning. And there's no conversations about it anywhere at all. And just as a Christian conservative, like, never dealt with this, like, I wanted to just hear this person out and have her explain to me why what's going on. And we did it. We shouldn't have done it in front of a microphone, right? That was, in hindsight, a huge mistake. Like, working out my divorce in front of a microphone or on social media a decade ago, like, those were mistakes. But I think but it's an incentive to go out and put those pain points on social media because you can get attention, and that attention then becomes the salve that heals the wounds, as opposed to kind of what you're talking about, which is more healthy forms of dealing with that pain and that trauma. And
that's where I think it's, in my view, so important to connect the pain. And I know this is very maybe high-minded and abstract, but to connect the pain to the actual philosophies that drive different belief systems.
Yeah.
Because then you're talking about the pain, not just of the specifics of what an individual experienced, right? Which can become, in my view, often very voyeuristic very quickly. And instead, you're talking about, how do we understand what it looks like in your community of shared beliefs? What does marginalization look like? Because that's where I come from. And part of that, Chris, is very personal. You mentioned earlier, like, what was some of the impetus for this? And it took me a long, there's a whole journey of time that it took me to determine, do you really want to step into a more cultural arena? I'm more comfortable in policy roles. I've obviously worked in law and journalism and policy, and that's been my forte for some time. And part of what ultimately drew me there was that we're not having actual conversations about how belief systems operate in relation to marginalization. And when you have more belief systems in a society, you have more different flavors of marginalization, obviously, because different people fall on the margins of different beliefs. And not only different people falling on different margins of different beliefs, but I think you have a lot more isolation. Because you have different people whose individual experiences cause them to fall on the marginalization, quote unquote, of different types of beliefs. So they never really feel like they have a home. And that was one of my experiences as a younger millennial, because I am a younger millennial. I was born in the early 90s. I don't care if that dates me. And so when I was, for example, being involved in the homeschooling movement was always such an interesting kind of isolating factor, because everyone came at it from such a politicized standpoint that they weren't really interested in what your homeschooling experience was like. It was, how can your experience be used to support my broader view of the either utility or terribleness of homeschooling itself? And that's the kind of stuff where I think we don't really have any idea what that looks like, because stories now, from what I can tell culturally, are primarily used as a vehicle to have an emotional hook to push a pre-existing policy agenda. And I think I
find this, I hate to make it racial, I just find I have access to a big diverse audience through the Pat Down and BET and those audiences, and lots of conversations with them, and I find it to be a very white-centric thing that we look for information that proves we are right, being right. And it's a very conservative white view, but it really happens on the left too. There's a religiosity to like the hardcore progressive. If you don't believe this, then you are a sinner, right? There's just this need to be proved right. Right. And I know that lurks within me. It is part of me. I look at pieces of information and I go, this proves I was right. And that to me is something that I've had to check and go, okay, this is like a person. Right? You're beating up on another person to prove that you were right. Even if it's just some famous person that I will never connect with or hear. I don't know. I find that to be an impulse that, as a suburban American, maybe not a racial thing, but just suburban people, the mindset that I grew up with, everything was about my own rightness. And that culturally is a thing that I've had to fight a little bit in terms of my analysis and understanding people. And my Christianity has had to fight that. Because when you are trying to look for confirming information, then you are not actually listening to the Spirit and trying to understand what God is teaching you and the people He's trying to connect you to. You're trying to serve yourself by proving your worth through being right. And it's just it's a thing that I have noticed in my suburban world that I have lived in for 40 years that I don't see in other cultures that I interact with, right? Like there's a live and let live with Black listeners and friends, and it's all right, fine.
It's fascinating because I think I went straight from a fairly obviously the pretty more extreme in homeschooling back in the day was not normative by any stretch of the imagination. But certainly in universities, I would say the same held true. So I was more in that academic kind of environment post high school. And that's still more or less, when you're in the policy world, you're in a more similar type of avenue or type of cultural space, right? It has fairly similar norms that govern it. And so that's fascinating because I would say it was very similar. I remember some of the most striking things that I recall still from my first semesters of college were the extreme prejudice, not prejudice like I hate you personally, but prejudice as in the person in front of me clearly had only ever heard of homeschooling or from some extreme TV show they had watched. The questions you're getting are like questions that would be, if you were on a range of microaggressions, these would be macroaggressions. I mean, they were like,
you're clearly FLDS. Yeah, I brought a lot of that baggage too, because I had a lot of those like cultural assumptions about homeschooling, and my wife is the oldest of 11, homeschooled. She runs the homeschool prom with her family. We are on the board that runs the homeschool graduation here. Like I loved my public schooling. I'm not an enemy of public schooling. I think there's good things and bad things about it. We would homeschool our kid if we could. There's extenuating circumstances. Like to me, there's good and bad about both models, right? But I didn't start out that way. I had to experience how much of a better education my brother and sisters-in-laws and my wife had than me in a lot of ways, and the experiences and how superior they were. Like it's exposure. I think a piece of this is, along with rightness, it's comfort.
Yes.
And so
yes.
I tend to find people in suburban America love comfort, and I'm that way too, which is not a Christian doctrine. If I don't understand you as a homeschooler, you make me uncomfortable.
Yes. But that's again where I'm trying to go with this idea of there's nuance in this, and that's where for those who are interested in following along, you'll find a lot more content that continues to engage with these more nuanced stances, including the upcoming book I'll be writing, and upcoming works following that. Again, I have a very long-term vision of what I want my writing to look like, but when it comes to, it's hard for me to stress enough that when it comes to things like homeschooling or other forms of alternate lifestyle, so to speak, because that really in the 90s was considered a pretty alternate form of lifestyle. There's a lot of, again, these boring kind of weird hypocrisies. I remember as a kid thinking, it's so odd that I'm always hearing of how alternate lifestyles are a good thing from this more left-wing side, but God forbid you homeschool. That's not the right kind of alternate lifestyle. We want a different form. And then you also have to take into account that there's a lot of complexity in each individual's experience. So I think, are often socially supposed to think in binary terms as far as experiences. My homeschooling, and this was widespread when people would ask me about, did you like homeschooling? And so it's a little more complicated than it was good or bad. So what makes that experience good or bad? And there's sometimes something that you may have thought was amazing about an experience that you would 100% replicate, that you go, there's this other aspect that wasn't that great. So particularly when it comes to something, I think like that, you're like homeschooling. Sorry, not just that, like homeschooling. You're talking about someone's, really what you're asking is, what was your home life like? Does that make sense? Because it's so intimately connected with your family that you're really asking someone to divulge the entirety of their home life, because it's so deeply connected, right? So the extent to which you had a kind of confusing, or there were some things good about my home life and some things bad, is where your homeschooling experience is going to land.
Nothing will pick apart the way that you were raised and the way that the family structure that you existed in, like getting married and having kids.
Yes.
Because now I look at the way that I was raised in a very secular, question nothing, go along with the flow, whatever your teachers tell you is fine existence, compared to her existence of libertarian Christian homeschooler. We're too reformed to go to a Presbyterian church.
Oh no.
Let's think about devotion and intentionality in every aspect that my parents didn't have. My parents almost had this is not a negative on my parents because they did an awesome job, but there was almost, we're running a business, we're trying to survive and keep our head above water, versus her family, which is maybe we sink below the water a little bit, but there's an intentionality with our kids that we're going to have that maybe other families don't, that I've learned a lot from, and that I found a little bit negative or had a negative impression of. And I think COVID, if you look at COVID, this is probably a great example for people started with one view of COVIDiots. And I think 2 years after had a different view, or had moved maybe from, yeah, there are people still getting 2 boosters a month, right? Those are like fringe people. But I think you saw people start at one place and get to, I saw it with a lot of my progressive friends, like, wait a minute, you're telling me that I can get COVID if I get the shot? Like, you told me I wouldn't. So what's going on here? Like, why are we putting the orange fencing around the playgrounds? Like, so I think that's one place where people for a year had a really harsh view of a minority in the country. And then over a period of a couple years started to maybe not go all the way to certain places.
Sure.
But I think if you look at like the popularity of Robert Kennedy Jr., you'd go, all right, maybe there's a lot more people that kind of moved towards maybe even past where like I am with a lot of COVID stuff. And you go, all right, maybe the conspiracy theorists were right on these pieces. And that's, I think, far different than maybe 10 years ago, where if you were a conspiracy theorist or Alex Jones, I wouldn't take you seriously at all. I wouldn't even listen to you.
Sure. I think you're 100% correct. And I think it's just a hard timeline to learn those lessons in, because everything is so siloed. Heck, it's been a wild ride when I speak of the editorial decisions I've made to determine how I want to start fleshing out the writing and where I want it to go. It's tough because long form is really not discouraged right now. And podcasting, I think, has really helped with that. But what I mean is that people tend to only engage with little snippets and bite-sized type pieces of information. And it makes it hard to take a step back and see enough information to fully contextualize different events. And that's where I'm hopeful that I can lend a really helpful, like, nuanced voice to some of these issues that are talked about, frankly, and from what I can tell, almost exclusively talking points formats, of like, you already know where the person's going to go with it. There's not a lot of like differentiation between viewpoint A and B. There's these binary viewpoints. Most people already know what the talking points are going to be, and you fall into one camp or the other. And there's not a lot of exploration of how someone may have gotten to a different vantage point, or what different prejudices look like. Like I say, I joke in there's a whole poem, by the way, titled Progressive Prejudice, which is 100% a satirical critique of the way progressivism operates on college campuses. So it's designed to be, mocking the ways in which progressive dogma says it's very open-minded, but operates almost in the same closed-minded sphere as a highly fundamentalist, like, Christian mindset, where there's zero room for any kind of dissent. And I'm going, this is so weird.
Have you read Noah Rothman's book? It's got The Rise of the New Puritan.
Oh, I think I have that in my checklist on Amazon to buy, but I don't.
It's so good. That and
good?
Also John McWhorter's book, Woke Racism, I think it's called.
Yes, I've read that one.
Yeah. 2 very good books that kind of really think about the mindset, the worldview, and the operation of kind of the groupthink of it, right? Like, I think people think that they're individualistic thinkers, but we're all pack animals, right? Yes. So we can't break out of the mindset of who are you choosing, Donald Trump or Joe Biden, so I can determine whether you're a good person or not. So let's go back and finish with hope.
Yeah.
And despair. I think a lot of people are despairing about this election, and they're putting their faith in the wrong places. What would you say to somebody that just feels totally dejected and despairing about 2024?
I would say there's actually a lot of reason to feel despair. And I don't think that should be brushed over. I don't think hope is a simplistic concept of just hope in spite of pain. That's an easy thing to do. However, we all exist in just a tiny subset of human history. I mean, I'm critiquing the postmodern era, but let's be real, the postmodern era hasn't been going on from a historical vantage point for very long. And so we all exist in this small subset of human history. And I think one of the things I would hope people take away from feeling this despair is that hope transcends not just despair, but it transcends your lifetime. You don't know what the effect of your existence will be down the road. And that's where I think there's a Jordan Peterson quote where he talks about this, where he talks about, you don't know the hole you're leaving. You don't know what other people are going to miss out on because of you. And I think that taking that attitude into day-to-day life can really help individuals to see past the hypocrisies and oppressions of the moment, because those are very real. They're going to happen. People are going to treat you poorly, so on and so forth. But knowing that you're not in control of what happens long term, you're only in control of how you respond to the circumstances that you've been handed, can help people to craft a more hopeful approach to life that's radically indifferent towards the outcome of whether, like, for instance, whether you're successful in your own life. That's less important than you having integrity in your day-to-day moments, right? The way you treat people every day, the way you try to understand the world around you in spite of maybe not even having the best access to resources or whatnot, or even the highest IQ. I think that there's a lot of wisdom people can derive just from contemplating what is good. I want to ask big questions and answer them, regardless of where you're at in life, and trying to have integrity and live according to your conscience. These are the kind of things everyone has control over. And I think the more you pursue them and the more you pursue seeking out what is good, I think the closer you'll end up getting to God. I think a lot of people have come to faith that way. For instance, if you're truly trying to pursue what's good, I think that's always a good first step. Like, even if you're not someone who has belief or someone that would live or hold beliefs in accordance to the Bible, I think those are all things that you can do. And hope is something that can ground you. And it's a habit. It's a habit of saying, I'm going to continue to trust that if I live according to my conscience, then the best things will happen to me. Not the best things like I'll suddenly get $1 million and have the home I always wanted and have a life free of like harm. But yeah. But instead that it would ground individuals.
So sorry about that. I hope you saw my little note.
Oh shoot, did I?
No, my kid had
you're good. Yeah,
a bathroom emergency, so she was
You're fine.
I was like,
you're fine. Yeah, no, you're good. You know what? I'm gonna have one of those here in the coming month.
You will, I promise. The worst was when I had a very proper business meeting, and she has figured out the Alexa drop-in feature.
No.
And she goes, Daddy, can you please come wipe me? They brought it up the next time I met them, so I know that was like an instant office classic. My kid, my wife and the baby are sleeping, and so I'm like, I can't just. I know we were almost done with the interview, but I was like, I just don't want her to sit there for another 5 minutes.
Oh, so. You're fine. I am the most chill, Chris. Like totally.
So I hope I didn't freak you out. It wasn't your point.
No, I was like, oh, something happened, and I just rolled with it. You're fine.
All right, cool. All right, if I disappeared, you're watching on the video, I had a kid emergency. Leslie's a champ. She kept going and is very understanding. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. I know it's weird when the host just gets up and leaves.
Hey, you know what happens? But hey, I was talking about the radical lack of control that you should try to exert over life. That you should be more concerned with just how you react and carrying on with your daily affairs.
No, we are. Yeah, it really just having a family has changed so much for me. My dreams and hopes and career and everything has just, I've struggled the last couple years because I'm trying to look at it and go, man, I operated for 20, 30 years out of this set of assumptions and motivations and have built a career trying to do X. And now all I want to do is just hang out with my kids, and I don't want to be internet famous anymore. And I want to serve people, but I think that's been something that's definitely spoken to me. And really, I realized it on this podcast years ago talking about it. Because if we're libertarians, what can you really affect? You can't really affect much, right? You can't. The Libertarian Party, God bless them, or go for it, Justin Amash, you'll change it from the inside again. There's really, at the end of the day, what you can do is, I watched the movie Big Fish and it clicked for me. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, but it's really good. He's being carried by his son to the river to be released, and there's all the people from the movie are standing around as he's basically dying. And it hit me, it's like the 100 people, you just got to serve your circle of people. The people that are coming to your funeral, that is the people that you are called to serve. It is not try to build a giant podcast or try to become a viral sensation on TikTok or try to change the world by becoming the next elected politician. It's I do this with that modus operandi now. That is my working theory, in much the same way that your working theory for your poetry is focused on the same message.
It's really I'm trying to focus on getting the message to where it can go, and focusing on the consistency and integrity of the message over the other considerations that often come into play when you're talking about marketing considerations, or you know how this works, right? Like you're thinking, okay, this would make more sense from a pure success standpoint, but is that what this is about? Or is this about trying to carve out a space for having consistent, clear, and conscience-based conversations and writing about those kind of topics in a way that's consistent and persuasive and reflects aspects of society that are generally dismissed and ignored. And that doesn't often come with a lot of fanfare at the start, but I do think I think it's a very important endeavor, and one I'm really glad I've launched. So if anyone's interested in following along on Substack, or obviously I'm on Instagram X, and I have a website, lesliecorbly.com, where you can access the book. And I'm hoping to find other spaces to have these conversations. I certainly appreciate you creating a place for this kind of content.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime. I'd love to have you back and this is a great conversation and talk worldviews and maybe tackle a topic and break it apart.
I was going to say, if you're interested, I can send you another one of the poems I'm doing, because I have content monthly coming out on Substack. So if you're interested, I'd be more than happy to shoot you another sort of theme that I'm talking about, as that will be ongoing. And then I foresee longer form book projects in my future. And that's the space I'm heading in, and we'll continue to keep you in the loop.
Yeah, no, what you won't hear is we'll open up with the things that you sent me. So people will hear it. We'll talk about that afterwards. But yeah, I'd love to have you back. So lesliecorbly.com, you said?
Yes, yep.
All
Just
right.
first name, last name.com.
Check the description. You'll find all the links there. So thanks so much for being here. We really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. If you got something out of this, the best thing you can do is share this with your friends, share this with your family. It helps me, it helps Leslie, and word of mouth is the best way for a podcast to grow, for a book of poetry to grow, is for you to say to your friends that think like you do, hey, you'll be touched by this, you'll be inspired by this. So thanks so much. And thank you for joining us here on The Chris Spangle Show.